My name is Frank Dalton, and on my 68th birthday, my son sent me a gift that nearly killed the wrong man. It looked like a beautiful bottle of whiskey, deep green label, gold lettering, the kind of gift a father might treasure. But I hadn't touched a drop in years because of my heart condition. Instead, I gave it to Robert, my son's father-in-law, a man I respected. The next morning, Robert collapsed. The doctors whispered words no one wants to hear: poisoning. That's when I realized my son hadn't sent me a gift, he'd sent me a message. Before we begin this story, I want to know, where are you watching from, and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more powerful stories like this one. I never imagined a birthday gift could carry such a heavy shadow, but that's exactly what happened on my 68th. The box sat on my kitchen table, sunlight catching on the wax seal like it was holding fire inside. No card, no warm note, just a plain envelope taped to the side with two cold words written in blue ink: "Happy Birthday." That was it. No dad, no signature. But I knew that handwriting as surely as I knew my own reflection. It belonged to my son Ethan, the boy I had raised for 2 decades, the man I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. My heart clenched tighter than I'd expected, not from joy, but from the ache of recognition. When I lifted the bottle from its box, it was the sort of whiskey that collectors boast about: deep green label, gold lettering, heavy glass, that made you feel like you were holding more than liquor. Once upon a time, I might have poured myself a slow finger of it, sitting out on the porch swing with Linda, my late wife, letting the crickets fill the silence between us. But that life was gone. After my heart attack, the doctor had laid it out plain: no more whiskey, no more indulgence if I wanted to see another decade. Ethan had been there when I got that news. He'd stared at his phone, thumbs moving across the screen, as if my mortality was just background noise. He knew I couldn't drink it, and yet he'd chosen this gift. I didn't see generosity in it. I saw distance. 3 years without a word, and now this: not an apology, not a bridge, just a bottle that felt like it was meant to sit unopened, mocking me from a shelf. I pushed it to the far side of the table and went back to my coffee, now gone cold. But as the day wore on, I thought about Robert Carson. Robert wasn't blood, but he'd been more family and action than Ethan had been in years. After a storm tore the shingles from my roof, Robert had shown up with his hammer before I'd even asked. He never arrived empty-handed, and he never left without helping. If anyone deserved something special, it was him. By mid-afternoon, I had buckled that bottle into the passenger seat of my old Chevy like it was a fragile guest. Gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up to Robert's white clapboard house, its wraparound porch glowing in the October light. He opened the door in a red flannel sawdust still clinging to his boots. When I handed him the bottle and muttered, "From Ethan," his eyebrows rose. "This is something, Frank," he said, running his thumb over the wax seal. I told him to make tonight special, and his grin said he would. Driving home, I felt lighter, but that feeling wouldn't last. Ethan's gift wasn't just a bottle. It was the opening move in a game I hadn't chosen to play. So let me ask you, what would you have done in my place? Kept it, thrown it away, or passed it along like I did? The next morning started like any other. I brewed coffee, opened the paper, and tried to let the house feel alive with routine. The October light was pale, stretching across the kitchen floor in long bars. For a brief moment, I convinced myself yesterday had just been an odd ripple, a gift from a son who didn't know how to say what he meant. But then the phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, though the area code was local. I answered, half expecting a telemarketer. Instead, a woman's voice, tight and trembling, filled the line. "Mr. Dalton, this is Linda Carson, Robert's wife." My hand gripped the receiver harder. "Robert collapsed this morning. He's in the hospital. They think it might be some kind of poisoning. Her words stole the breath from my lungs. Poisoning. I froze, staring at the empty spot on my counter where the whiskey bottle had been just a day ago. He was fine last night, Linda continued. We had a drink with dinner, and this morning he could barely stand. My mouth went dry. What did he eat? Anything unusual, I asked. No, she said quickly, then a pause. But he did have a glass from the bottle you brought over. For a long second, I couldn't speak. My mind replayed the image of Robert's grin as he accepted that gift, the way he'd said, "This is something Frank." And now he was lying in a hospital bed, his heart struggling against something he never saw coming. My stomach twisted not just with fear, but with guilt. I hadn't taken a sip, but I'd put the bottle into his hands. I hung up and stood in the silence of my kitchen, unable to move. That's when I saw it near the bottom of the trash bin, a small plastic vial, the kind vitamins come in. No label, just a dusting of powder clinging to the inside. I didn't remember throwing it away. My pulse kicked hard against my ribs. Slowly, I picked it up, turning it in my hand. Something about it felt wrong. I opened the refrigerator, and there, tucked behind the milk, sat a mason jar with a splash of whiskey I had poured before leaving for Robert's. I hadn't even realized I'd saved it until that moment. Now it looked like the only thread of truth left between me and a nightmare. My hands shook as I set it on the counter beside the vial. I knew exactly who to call. Gary Thompson, an old friend from my service days, now running a small veterinary lab outside town. Years back, I'd pulled his truck out of a ditch in a snowstorm, and he'd never forgotten it. "Gary," I said when he picked up my voice low, "I need you to test something for me." Quietly. He didn't ask questions, just told me to meet him after closing. That night, I drove out with the mason jar wrapped in a paper bag on the seat beside me. The sky was dark, the road empty, and every mile carried the same thought. If Robert was poisoned, then my son had sent me more than a birthday gift. He'd sent me a death sentence meant for me. So tell me, if it had been you, would you have called the police right away or held on to the evidence like I did? Gary didn't waste words when I pulled into the cracked parking lot of his lab. He met me outside, still wearing his lab coat over a sweatshirt, hands shoved in his pockets against the cold night air. "Let's see it," he said quietly. I passed him the bag, and he carried it inside like it was something alive that might bite. I sat in my truck with the engine running, headlights pointed at nothing, and listened to the hum of the heater while my thoughts turned in circles. When Gary called the next afternoon, his voice carried the kind of weight you can hear even before he says the words. "Frank, you're not going to like this. There's something in that whiskey. White snake root." The name hit me like a blow. I closed my eyes, remembering my grandmother's stories about cattle dying after grazing on the plant. Gary continued, "In the right dose, it'll stop a man's heart." What I found wasn't an accident. Somebody measured it. That phrase echoed in my skull. This wasn't carelessness. It was intent. Robert drank it, I admitted, my voice low. Gary let out a long breath. "Then he's lucky to still be alive. You luckier. Frank, if you'd taken a single glass, your heart never would have handled it." I thanked him, but the words felt hollow. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the mason jar still half filled with that amber liquid. It looked harmless golden in the light, but I knew better now. My son had put poison in my hands, and I had passed it along to a man who trusted me. The guilt pressed heavier than any weight I'd ever carried. That evening, I made myself walk into Robert's hospital room. The sight of him lying there, skin pale against the sheets, hit me like a punch. Machines beeped slowly, stubbornly, keeping pace with his fragile heart. Linda sat nearby, her hands clenched together. She looked up when she saw me, eyes rimmed red. "They found plant toxins," she whispered. "The doctors are still running tests." I stepped closer to Robert's bed. He looked nothing like the man who once climbed my roof without being asked. His breath was shallow, his hair fallen across his forehead. I wanted to tell Linda everything right there, the whiskey, Ethan, the vial in my trash. But I bit it back. Not yet. Without proof that could stand in front of others, my words would only sound like suspicion. When I got home, I opened a legal pad, drew a line down the center, and labeled the columns, "What I know and what I can prove." Under "No," I wrote, "Ethan sent the bottle." Ethan knew I couldn't drink. Ethan asked if I had tried it. Under "Prove," I wrote Gary's test, the leftover sample, my memory of Ethan's phone call. The gap between the two lists stared back at me like a canyon. I pulled a small digital recorder from my desk drawer, slid it into my jacket pocket, and patted it once against my chest. If Ethan was going to give me answers, I'd make sure they didn't vanish into silence. Now I want to ask you, if your own child became the prime suspect in something like this, would you confront him face to face or let the police handle it first? I drove to Ethan's house the next day with the recorder tucked in my jacket, its weight pressing against my ribs like a reminder that every word mattered now. His place looked exactly the way I imagined he wanted the world to see him, neat siding, manicured lawn books stacked on shelves inside that were more for show than for reading. When he opened the door, his expression flickered surprise first, then calculation, then a smile he thought would fool me. "Dad," he said, stepping aside. "This is unexpected." I walked in without waiting for an invitation. The smell of lemon cleaner hung in the air, too sharp to feel natural. His kitchen counter held 3 bottles of bourbon and rye lined up like trophies, none of them the brand he had sent me. I rested my finger along the rim of an empty glass near the sink, casual but deliberate. "Robert liked the bottle you sent," I said. "Said it was the nicest pour he'd ever had." He blinked once, slower than instinct. "Yeah." His voice pitched upward like he was fishing for information. "Funny thing," I said, keeping my tone flat. "I never told you where I stored it." For the smallest fraction of a second, his jaw tightened. He tried to cover it with a laugh. "You must have mentioned it. You get chatty when you're sentimental." "I didn't," I said, meeting his eyes and holding them until he looked away. The recorder in my pocket captured the silence that followed, louder than any shouted denial. He grabbed a dish towel and started drying a glass that had already been dried. "Dad, you've always overthought everything. You're looking for problems where there aren't any." His voice sounded rehearsed, like lines from a play he'd practiced in the mirror. "You sent me a $500 bottle I can't drink," I replied evenly. "That's not generosity. That's intent." His hands froze mid-motion before he forced another smile. "Maybe just give me the benefit of the doubt for once." I let the pause linger, then asked the question I had carried with me all night. "Did you tamper with that whiskey?" The silence that followed stretched long enough for the hum of his refrigerator to mark time. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Sometimes silence is a confession in itself. I turned toward the door. "Goodbye, Ethan." "Dad," he called after me, his tone caught between a plea and a warning. "If you keep accusing me, you'll push me away." I didn't turn back. "I'm not accusing," I said to the door. "I'm collecting." When I slid into my truck, I pressed my thumb against the recorder's stop button, watching the red light blink off. It sat on the passenger seat like a witness waiting for its day in court. My hands were steady, but my chest felt like it carried both grief and fury in equal measure. "So I'll ask you, if you heard silence where there should have been a denial, would you take that as guilt the way I did when I left Ethan's house that day? I didn't head straight home. Instead, I parked in the far corner of a grocery store lot engine off recorder resting on the seat beside me. I stared at it, replaying his silence in my mind. That pause had been heavy, calculated, not the reflex of an innocent man caught off guard. I'd spent a lifetime reading people, neighbors, soldiers, family, and silence like that was never empty. It was loaded. By the time I drove home, the October sky had turned gray clouds pressing low like the ceiling of a room you couldn't escape. Inside the house felt too quiet, like it was waiting to hear what I would do next. I set the recorder and the mason jar on the kitchen table, then pulled out my legal pad again. I drew the same two columns, what I know and what I can prove. Under know, I added Ethan's silence when confronted. His attempt to gaslight me. His habit of over-explaining what didn't need explaining. Under prove, I listed Gary's lab results, the whiskey sample, the recorded silence. The gap between the columns was still there, but it was closing. I called Gary. When he answered, I didn't waste time. "It's gone," I said. "What is the little vial I told you about?" "Someone took it from my trash." "I didn't move it, Gary. Someone's been inside my house." He didn't try to reassure me. He just said, "Frank, you need law enforcement looped in. I can confirm what's in the whiskey, but without that vial, the chain of evidence is thinner. Don't let this get buried." He was right. For the first time in years, I felt like the ground beneath my feet had shifted. My own home, once my safest place, had been breached. I checked the doors, the latches, the windows. Everything was locked. Still, I could feel the intrusion, like a handprint on the wall, invisible but undeniable. I sat down at the table and wrote everything I could remember. Time of Ethan's call. The pause after I told him I'd given the bottle to Robert. The missing vial. The recording I had just captured. Every word became a nail hammered down so I couldn't second-guess myself later. When I finished, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I'd been holding back from calling. "Detective Reyes," a voice answered on the second ring. "This is Frank Dalton," I said. "I believe I have information about a poisoning. I have a sample of the substance and an audio recording that might interest you." He didn't press me for details over the line. Men like him don't ask for the whole story at once. He simply asked me to come in that afternoon. I hung up and sat at the table, my eyes drifting toward the mason jar glowing faintly in the dull light. It looked harmless, but I knew better. My son had sent me a message written in poison, and now the only question was whether I would live long enough to answer it. "So tell me, if it were your child, would you turn everything over to the police as I did, or would you try to handle it within the family first?" Walking into the police station that afternoon, I felt every one of my 68 years settle on my shoulders. The place smelled like copier toner and floor wax, but under that was something sharper, the tension of lives being sorted between truth and lies. Detective Reyes met me in a small office at the back. His tie-loosened eyes sharp in a way that told me he had already heard things he couldn't ignore. "Mr. Dalton," he said, motioning for me to sit. "Tell me about the whiskey." So I did. I told him about the package, the cold handwriting that could only be Ethan's, the gift I'd handed to Robert, and the hospital call that followed. I laid out Gary's test results, the leftover sample in the mason jar, and finally set the recorder on his desk. Reyes didn't touch it at first. He just looked at me, weighing whether this was a story built from grief or evidence. "You understand," he said finally, "this doesn't become a case because we feel something. It becomes a case when what you've given me can survive other people looking at it." "I do," I said. "That's why I came." He nodded and lifted the recorder, turning it in his hand. "We'll copy this. We'll send the liquid to the state lab. If there's cause, we move. If not, I'll tell you why we can't." His calm steadiness was almost enough to steady me too. Almost. I left the office lighter, but only by degrees. Outside, the October air carried the smell of rain, sharp and metallic. For the first time in days, I felt like I wasn't the only one carrying this weight. Still, the drive home was filled with unease. I kept thinking about Ethan's voice when I told him Robert had the whiskey, the way it had cooled instantly, like a door slamming shut. My own son, blood of my blood, looked at me as an obstacle, not a father. That thought gnawed at me until the porch light of my house came into view. Inside, I opened the fireproof box again, sliding the index cards neatly beside Linda's wedding ring and the deed to the house. On the latest card, I wrote Reyes has sample and audio, case pending. Writing the words didn't make them lighter, but it made them real. I sat at the table long into the evening, listening to the tick of the wall clock. Each second felt like a question: had I just saved myself, or had I declared war on my own son? Either way, there was no turning back. The phone rang once more before I went to bed. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Later, I pressed play. Ethan's voice strained but steady. "Dad, we need to talk. Sooner is better than later." I didn't call him back. Instead, I wrote down the time, copied his words exactly, and slipped the card into the fireproof box. The space between us had widened into something that couldn't be crossed by a single phone call. So let me ask you, if your son left you that kind of message, would you answer, or would you let silence speak for you? The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee I had no appetite for. The fireproof box sat open in front of me, its contents like pieces of a puzzle no father should ever have to solve. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, drew a line down the middle, and wrote 2 words at the top: what I know and what I can prove. On the left side, the list was damning. Ethan sent the bottle. Ethan knew I couldn't drink. Ethan's voice had hardened when I said I gave it to Robert. His silence after my question about tampering. On the right side, the list was thinner. Gary's test results, the whiskey sample, the recording of Ethan's silence, the voicemail where he asked to talk sooner. The canyon between the 2 columns was wide. If this were a courtroom, feelings wouldn't be enough. Evidence mattered. And I intended to build it piece by piece until no one could deny the truth. I slipped the recorder into my jacket again, feeling the weight of it like a badge. This time I wasn't heading to the police. I was heading back to Ethan. I needed more than suspicion. I needed him to hand me something I could use. His house looked the same as before, too neat, too polished, but I noticed details I hadn't the first time. A stack of empty shipping boxes in the garage, the kind you'd order in bulk. Shelves lined with jars of dried plants. My stomach tightened at the sight of them. Ethan opened the door with that same practiced smile. "Dad, twice in a week. That's a surprise." I stepped inside without a word. The lemon smell still lingered. My eyes drifted to the counter where a glass sat, half-dried, rim faintly stained. "Robert liked it," I said again. Said it was the best he ever had. His hand froze for just a second before he reached for a towel. "Well, I'm glad he enjoyed it. But you knew he would, didn't you?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. He glanced up, smile faltering. "What's that supposed to mean?" I let the silence hang long enough to press into the air between us. The recorder in my pocket captured it, steady as my heartbeat. Finally, he shrugged. "Dad, you always think there's more going on than there really is. Maybe you should just enjoy the gift for what it was." I leaned forward slightly. A gift meant for me. A gift that put Robert in the hospital. The color drained from his face just for a blink, then he recovered. "You can't seriously think I'd do that." "I don't think," I said quietly. "I collect. I turned and walked out before he could spin another excuse. In my truck, I pressed stop on the recorder and stared at the red light fading. Each silence he gave me was another nail in the coffin of his own defense. Back home, I added a new card to the box second visit. Jars in garage. Half-dried glass. No denial when confronted. The box was filling fast, but not fast enough. Proof was growing, but danger was too. So tell me, would you keep pushing your own son for evidence? Or would you stop before the risk swallowed you whole? By the third day, I no longer trusted the quiet around my house. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from peace. It was the silence of being watched. I'd lived long enough to know the difference. That morning, I checked the back door and saw something that made my chest tighten. The thread I had taped across the frame, a simple trick from my service days, had been moved. Not broken, just shifted enough that I knew someone had opened the door and put it back. My house had been entered. I walked through each room, slow and deliberate, hands clasped behind my back. Nothing was missing, not at first glance. But when I opened the kitchen trash, the little vitamin vial I'd found 2 days earlier was gone. Someone had taken it. My pulse steadied into the kind of rhythm you only get when your instincts scream, but you can't afford to panic. I called Gary. "It's gone," I said. "What is the vial?" "Someone took it out of my trash." He didn't question me. "Then they know you're ahead of them." "Frank, you need to keep Reyes in the loop." "I will," I said, though. I hated the thought of handing over more of my life to the system. But Gary was right. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a game of moves and counter-moves. That night, I found an envelope wedged into my front door. No return address. Inside was a printed photo of my own porch, taken from across the street in the dark. The porch swing hung still, the light above the door casting a faint glow. No figure in the frame. Just my house, my sanctuary, turned into a target. I carried it to the kitchen table, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and wrote the date and time on an index card. Then I called Reyes. He arrived 40 minutes later with a younger officer named Patel. They photographed the envelope, the porch, and the frame of the door. Reyes's face stayed steady, but I saw the tension in the way he pressed his lips together. "This is escalation," he said flatly. "Do not answer his calls. Do not meet him. We'll preserve camera footage from the neighborhood." After they left, I sat in my living room with the lights on. I wanted whoever was outside to know I was awake, that I wasn't hiding. The fireproof box sat open on the coffee table, its contents growing heavier by the day. Gary's test, the mason jar, Ethan's voicemails, now the photo. Every piece told the same story, even if Ethan's mouth never would. Just before midnight, my phone buzzed again. A voicemail, no ring. I pressed play. Ethan's voice, softer this time, almost whispering. "Dad, you went to the cops. That's not smart. We could have handled this. You're not thinking straight." I wrote it down word for word, slid the card into the box, and shut the lid. Whatever this was, it had moved past father and son. This was survival. "So tell me, if you found proof your child was circling your house in the night, would you wait for the law to catch up, or would you confront him directly?" When Detective Reyes told me the district attorney wanted to hear my statement under oath, I knew the fight had officially moved out of my kitchen and into the courthouse. I put on my best jacket, the one I hadn't worn since Linda's funeral, and carried the paper bag with the recorder and my notes, like it was a shield. The courtroom wasn't crowded, but the air was heavy. The judge, a woman with silver hair and eyes that gave nothing away, sat high above us. Reyes nodded to me from the back, while across the aisle Ethan sat with his lawyer Caldwell, a wiry man whose sharp smile made my skin crawl. Ethan didn't look at me at first. When he finally did, his eyes were flat like glass that reflected, but never absorbed. The DA guided me through the events: my birthday, the package, Robert's collapse, Gary's test, the missing vial. My voice stayed steady, though every word carried the weight of betrayal. I explained the recording, the silence that followed my question about tampering, the voicemail Ethan left, telling me we needed to talk. Then Caldwell rose for cross-examination, his voice smooth as oil. "Mr. Dalton, you claim you recognized your son's handwriting on the package, but you hadn't seen it in 3 years, correct?" "That's correct," I said. "So it's possible, isn't it, that you're mistaken?" "No," I said firmly. "A man knows his son's handwriting." He paced slowly. "Interesting. Because we have here a certified handwriting analysis that concludes the note could not have been written by Ethan Dalton." He held up the paper like a trophy. Murmurs rippled through the room. The DA objected, but the judge allowed it into the record. My stomach dropped. Caldwell smiled faintly. "So tell me, Mr. Dalton, is it possible your feelings toward your son are influencing your judgment? After all, you've had a strained relationship for years. Didn't you sell his mother's farm without consulting him?" The DA shot to his feet. "Objection irrelevant and inflammatory. Sustained," the judge said, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it. Caldwell had planted the seed of doubt. When it was over, I stepped down from the witness stand, heavier than I'd been in years. Outside, Robert waited with his cane. He put a hand on my shoulder. "They're throwing dirt," he said. "Doesn't matter if it's true. They just need to cloud the water." I nodded, but the words stung. For a moment I wondered if the fight I had started would break me before it ever broke Ethan. That night I sat on the porch with the fireproof box beside me, flipping through my index cards like a deck of old photos. Caldwell wanted to turn me into a bitter old man chasing ghosts. But the truth was still in my hands: the whiskey, the recordings, the evidence Ethan had scattered like breadcrumbs. "So tell me, if the law tried to paint you as nothing more than a resentful father, would you keep standing? Or would you give up the fight?" I didn't sleep much after that day in court. The cross-examination replayed in my head like a broken record. Caldwell's words had been designed to cut deep, to make me look like an old man blinded by bitterness. But as I sat at the kitchen table with the fireproof box open, I reminded myself of something Reyes had told me: the truth survives other people looking at it. The next morning, Reyes called. His voice carried a weight, but also a spark. "Frank, we pulled Ethan's phone records. There's a string of texts from a burner phone purchased 2 towns over. The messages line up with the night Robert collapsed." "What do they say?" I asked, bracing myself. He paused. "Dosage instructions, timing, and one message that reads, 'Make sure he gets it all in the first pour. Won't take much with his heart.'" The words chilled me. They were precise, deliberate, and they matched exactly what Gary had found in the whiskey. I gripped the phone until my knuckles went white. "Do you have copies? They'll be in evidence by noon. This is what we needed. Caldwell can argue handwriting all day, but texts don't lie." For the first time in weeks, I felt a measure of strength return. But that strength was short-lived. That evening, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, then played it back. Ethan's voice filled the room. "Dad, you're making a mess of this. They don't know the whole story. If anything happens, it's on you. Stop now." His tone was calm, almost soothing, but the words were a threat wrapped in silk. I wrote them down on a fresh card, slid it into the box, and stared at the stack of evidence that had grown heavier than any weapon. Later that night, I drove to the hospital to check on Robert. He looked stronger sitting up with a blanket draped across his lap. Linda gave me a tired smile. Robert motioned me closer. "You think Ethan did this?" I don't think I said quietly. "I know." Robert's eyes were steady. "Then don't let him spin you in circles. Men like him feed off hesitation. You be steady." I nodded, the words anchoring me. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store and bought 2 new deadbolts and a pack of stick-on alarms. When I installed them later that night, the metal smelled sharp, clean, like a line being drawn. If Ethan thought he could waltz into my house again, he'd hear a scream loud enough to wake the block. I sat in the living room afterward, watching the glow of the porch light spill across the yard. The recorder rested in my pocket. The box stood shut on the table, and for the first time I allowed myself to believe I had turned the corner. So tell me, when the evidence against your own child grows undeniable, do you keep pushing for justice, or do you pull back to protect the last shred of family left? The first sign that things were turning came in a plain brown envelope. No return address, just my name typed in block letters. I found it tucked into my mailbox on a cold October morning. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a glossy photo printed off a phone. It showed the front of my house, my porch, my swing, the light above the door glowing faintly. The angle told me it had been taken from across the street in the middle of the night. There was no person in the frame, but the absence was worse than a presence. Whoever stood behind that lens wanted me to know they could come as close as they pleased without being seen. I slipped the photo into a plastic sleeve and called Detective Reyes. He didn't ask questions. He just said he'd send someone to collect it. When Officer Patel arrived, he photographed the mailbox, the envelope, even the position of my shoes on the mat. I appreciated the thoroughness, but it didn't stop the unease creeping under my skin. For the first time since Linda's passing, I didn't feel at home in my own house. That night, I sat in the living room with the lights on the fireproof box at my feet like a loyal dog. I wasn't hiding in the dark. I wanted Ethan to know that if he was watching, I was wide awake. The house ticked and settled, the refrigerator hummed, and the porch swing creaked once, though no wind moved the trees. I didn't flinch. Fear has a smell, and I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it roll to voicemail. When I played it back, Ethan's voice slithered through the speaker. "Dad, you're letting strangers into our business. That's not smart. We could have handled this. You're not thinking straight." His tone wasn't angry, not even urgent. It was calm, measured, like a salesman trying to close a deal. That calmness made my skin crawl more than if he'd screamed. I wrote his words down, slid the card into the box, and closed the lid with a steady hand. This wasn't just about Robert anymore. It wasn't even just about me. Ethan wanted control. He wanted silence, and he wanted me afraid enough to stop. But I wasn't about to give him any of that. Later that night, as I double-checked the locks, I noticed a faint scuff on the strike plate of the front door. A mark that hadn't been there before. It was the kind of mark a key makes when it's just a hair off center, when someone has used it more than once. My stomach turned cold. Ethan had kept a copy of the house key. That explained how the vial disappeared. That explained why the thread I taped across the back door had been disturbed, but never broken. He didn't need to force his way in. He already had a way. So I'll ask you, if you knew your own child held a key to your house and was using it against you, would you change the locks, or would you set a trap and let him show his hand? The morning after I spotted the scuff on the doorframe, I stopped at the hardware store and bought 2 heavy brass deadbolts and a pack of stick-on alarms. The clerk made small talk about winter coming early, but I barely heard him. By the time I got home, I was set on one thing: Ethan might have a key to my past, but he wasn't going to hold one to my present. I spent the afternoon installing the locks, the sound of the drill steadying my hands more than any cup of coffee could. Each screw I tightened felt like another barrier against the chaos my son had dragged into my life. When the locks clicked shut for the first time, I felt a flicker of control return. The alarms were crude, shrieking little devices, but when I tested one, its piercing scream filled the house with a sound that reminded me of a battle cry. That night, I sat in the living room with the fireproof box on the table and the recorder in my jacket pocket. The porch light cast a steady glow across the yard, and I kept the curtains just slightly parted enough to see without being seen. Around 10, the phone buzzed again, unknown number. I let it go. Minutes later, a text came through, "Stop letting them in, or I will." No signature, just the words in thick black type, a threat stripped bare of pretense. I photographed the message, printed it, and slipped it into a sleeve for the box. Then I called Reyes. His voice was clipped but steady. "Don't respond. Forward it to me. We'll log it." The next day I drove to the station to give a formal statement. Reyes studied me across the desk. "Mr. Dalton, I need you to understand something. We're not just dealing with suspicion anymore. We're dealing with escalation. He's testing how far you'll bend." I leaned forward. "And what happens when I don't bend?" He didn't hesitate. "Then he'll break." Those words carried me home heavy as stone. I checked the locks twice before bed and set the alarms. The house felt different now, not safe but aware, like it knew it was being tested too. Just after midnight, the alarm shrieked. I bolted upright, heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed the phone, ready to call 911, but when I peered through the front window, there was no one. Just a padded envelope lying on the mat. The alarm still screamed as I opened the door and yanked it inside. I shut the door, disarmed the device, and tore the envelope open with shaking hands. Inside was another photo. This one wasn't of my porch. It was of me sitting at my own kitchen table, head bent over the legal pad where I'd been writing notes. The angle was from outside the window, taken while I thought I was alone. I slid to a chair, the picture trembling in my hand. My son wasn't just circling my house anymore. He was inside my life, recording it from the shadows. So I'll ask you, if someone you loved turned predator in your own home, would you keep building evidence? Or would you confront him and risk everything breaking at once? I didn't sleep after finding that photo of myself. The idea that Ethan had stood outside my window camera, pressed to the glass while I sat scribbling notes, it gnawed at me. The man I had raised, the boy I once taught to ride a bike, was now a stranger willing to turn my own home into a hunting ground. At dawn, I called Reyes. "He's watching me from the windows," I said. "I've got proof." "Don't throw it out," Reyes replied. "Bag it. I'll send Patel to collect it today. And Frank, don't make the mistake of trying to flush him out. He wants you rattled. Don't give him the satisfaction." By mid-morning, Patel arrived, photographed the envelope and the photo of me at the table, then sealed them in evidence bags. He looked me in the eye before leaving. "He's trying to break your nerves, sir. Don't let him." But my nerves weren't the only thing Ethan was aiming at. That afternoon, Robert's daughter Leah called me. Her voice was hushed, frayed at the edges. "Frank, I need to tell you something. Ethan's been different for a long time. He keeps jars in the garage, dried plants powders. I saw a label once, white snake root. I thought it was a hobby. Now I don't know." My chest tightened. "Do you have proof, photos, messages, anything?" She said quickly. "I've saved screenshots. I didn't know what they meant, but I'll give them to Detective Reyes." I can't stay quiet anymore. For the first time in days, relief pushed against the weight of dread. If Leah was willing to talk, Ethan's mask would crack faster than he imagined. That evening, as if on cue, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail. Ethan's voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "Dad, you think the police will keep you safe from what you started? You're wrong. Call me." I wrote his words on another card and slid it into the fireproof box. But inside, I knew this was no longer just about safety. This was about control. Ethan was trying to take it, and I was fighting to keep it. Later that night, I walked the house with the lights on, checking the locks, testing the alarms. Everything held. But when I opened the closet where I kept the fireproof box, I froze. The lid was shifted slightly off-center. My stomach dropped. I knew I had shut it tight that morning. Inside, the contents were still there, the notes, the recordings, the photos, but the order was wrong. Cards I had stacked neatly were shuffled. Someone had been in the box. Someone had touched my record of truth. I closed the lid, carefully set it back, and stood there with my hand on top of it, steadying myself. Ethan hadn't just tried to poison me. He was trying to erase me piece by piece until my story belonged to him. So I'll ask you if you discovered someone had rifled through the very box of evidence meant to protect you. Would you trust the system to hold? Or would you start preparing for a final confrontation yourself, ions asking me to confirm the timeline of receiving the Whiskey Roberts collapse and Gary's test results? I answered plainly, sticking to the facts. Each word was another nail holding the structure of my truth together. Then Caldwell stood buttoning his jacket as though preparing for theater. "Mr. Dalton," he began smoothly, "you've testified that you recognized your son's handwriting on the birthday package. But you admit you hadn't seen that handwriting in 3 years, correct?" "Yes," I replied. 3 years is a long time, isn't it? People change. Handwriting changes." He held up a document with a flourish. And according to a certified handwriting expert, this note could not have been written by Ethan Dalton. The courtroom murmured. The judge rapped her gavel, silencing the room. My throat tightened. Caldwell leaned forward, his voice slicing the air. "So, Mr. Dalton, are you telling us that your bitterness toward your estranged son is stronger than the word of a professional analyst? I'm telling you," I said, keeping my voice level, "that I know my son's handwriting. No analyst can change that." Caldwell's smile widened. "Or perhaps, Mr. Dalton, you've convinced yourself of something that isn't true because you want it to be true. Isn't it also true that you and Ethan had disputes over property? Specifically, you sold his mother's farm without consulting him." The DA shot up. "Objection, irrelevant and prejudicial, sustained," the judge said. But Caldwell had already gotten what he wanted. Doubt had been sown. I stepped down from the stand, feeling smaller than when I had gone up. Outside, the October air hit me like a slap. Robert waited near the courthouse steps, leaning hard on his cane. "They're throwing dirt," he said. "Doesn't matter if it sticks to you or not. They just need the jury to see dust in the air." I nodded, but the words rattled around in my chest. Caldwell's strategy was clear: paint me as a bitter old man, resentful of a son who had walked away. If he could make me look like the unreliable narrator of my own story, then every piece of evidence would feel weaker. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the fireproof box. The photo of me writing at the table, the text messages Leah had sent to Reyes, the mason jar of whiskey, all of it was real. But real didn't always win. Caldwell had reminded me of that. As I closed the lid of the box, I realized the counterattack had shifted. It wasn't just Ethan circling my house at night anymore. It was his lawyer circling me in daylight, trying to strip me of credibility. So let me ask you, if the world began doubting your truth because someone twisted the story, would you fight louder? Or would you let the evidence speak on its own? I woke the next morning with Caldwell's words still echoing in my head. Bitter. resentful. A father inventing demons where none existed. That was the story he wanted the jury to believe. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror lines carved deep from years of work and grief, and wondered if I looked like the man Caldwell described. Maybe I did. But looking the part didn't make the story true. By mid-afternoon, Reyes called. His tone was different this time, urgent, clipped. "Frank, we pulled something from Ethan's phone. Not just call records, but text messages to a burner. They read like instructions." I gripped the receiver tighter. "Read them to me." He did. "Make sure he gets it all in the first pour. Won't take much with his heart." Another, "Don't change the dosage this time." The words landed like blows, cold, clinical, without hesitation. And the timestamps I asked. "The night Robert collapsed," Reyes said. "The night you handed over that bottle." For a long moment I couldn't speak. My son had written his intentions in black and white. Proof etched in digital stone. "That's enough to break Caldwell's story," I finally said. Reyes agreed. "The DA will move to introduce them. Between this Leah's screenshots of the jars and Gary's test results, the defense doesn't have much ground left. But Frank, he knows he's cornered. Be careful." That evening I drove to the hospital with a folder of magazines for Robert. He was propped up in bed, color slowly returning to his cheeks. Linda sat knitting by his side. I handed him the magazines, and when Linda stepped out to talk with a nurse, Robert lowered his voice. "Frank, tell me straight. Do you have him?" I nodded. "We've got his words, Robert. In writing." Robert's hand tightened on his cane. "Then don't flinch. A man like that, he'll press harder when he sees you standing tall." I stayed longer than I planned, talking about trivial things, weather, football, even soup recipes. But beneath it all, the truth pulsed steady. The tide was turning. When I got home, the porch swing creaked once again. I opened the door, checked the alarms, and pulled out the fireproof box. On a fresh card, I wrote texts recovered, dosage instructions, timestamps match hospital collapse. I slid it in with the others. Minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. Ethan's voice calm but strained. "Dad, they don't understand. We could have handled this ourselves. If you keep pushing, it's on you. Stop now." I pressed stop, copied his words, and locked them away in the box. For the first time since my birthday, I felt something close to certainty. Ethan had played his hand. The poison, the photo, the silence, now the digital trail tied it all together. The counterattack wasn't over, but the cracks were showing. Caldwell could throw dirt. Ethan could whisper threats. But the evidence was louder than both of them combined. So tell me, if the proof you finally held in your hands meant destroying your own blood, would you still carry it into court? Or would you let it die quietly to keep the family name intact? The morning began with a knock I had been expecting, though my chest still tightened when I heard it. Sharp, deliberate raps on the front door. Through the window, I saw Detective Reyes standing with two officers, Patel among them, all dressed for work, that wouldn't stay on paper. Reyes held a folded document in a clear plastic sleeve. "Mr. Dalton," he said, "when I opened the door, we have a signed warrant. Judge approved it at 7:43. We're searching your son's residence today." I studied his face. Calm, steady, but with a trace of steel behind the eyes. "Do you need me there?" "No," Reyes said firmly. "And that's not a request. It's an instruction. We don't want you in his line of sight. Let us handle the search." I stepped back, watching as their convoy of vehicles rolled down the street, a black sedan and a marked cruiser pulling away like punctuation at the end of a sentence. The house felt emptier after they left, but also lighter. For weeks I had carried the fight alone. Now it was moving into official hands. Still, I couldn't sit still. I drove to a quiet grocery store lot 2 blocks from Ethan's house and parked where I had a view of the corner. I told myself I was just a man observing, not interfering. But deep down I knew I was drawn there by something I couldn't name, a need to see the truth unfold. From behind the cracked windshield, I watched officers approach Ethan's door. They knocked. A long pause. Then the door opened. My son stood there in a faded Cardinals t-shirt, his arms crossed, his face tight. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the stiffness of his posture. He stepped aside reluctantly, and the officers entered. Reyes followed, papers in hand. The minutes stretched like hours. I imagined drawers, opening boxes, shifting the slow, deliberate rhythm of a search. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale. Every second, I fought the urge to get out, to demand a front-row seat to the dismantling of my son's secrets. At last, an officer emerged carrying a clear evidence bag. Even from a distance, I could see the shape inside a whiskey bottle, the same brand, the same cereal style as the one Ethan had sent me. Only this one was half empty. My breath caught. Proof. Reyes stepped outside, scanning the street. His eyes landed on my truck, and he walked over. "You shouldn't be here," he said, leaning into my window. "Too late for that." "What did you find?" "A couple more bottles from the same batch. One sealed, one open. The open one's got residue, white powder, faint, same as what Gary found." He lowered his voice. "And a notebook. Handwritten dosage notes, initials, dates. We'll get it copied before it goes into evidence, but Frank, it's bad." I swallowed hard. "How bad?" His answer was simple. "Bad enough to prove you weren't the only target. So let me ask you, if the search of your child's home uncovered your initials next to a lethal dose, would you feel vindicated or shattered beyond repair?" The trial opened in a hushed courtroom, every creak of the benches carrying farther than words. I sat behind the prosecution table, hands folded, the fireproof box of evidence locked away in Reyes's custody. Across the room, Ethan walked in, wearing county orange. His wrists were cuffed, but his chin was high, eyes cold and unflinching. For a moment, our gazes met. I saw no recognition, no trace of the boy I had raised, just a man daring me to follow through. The DA's opening was steady, deliberate. "This case is about trust," she told the jury. Trust between a father and a son. A trust betrayed in the most calculated way possible. She spoke of the whiskey, the lab tests, the digital trail of dosage instructions. Every word pressed like a hammer. Caldwell rose with that same thin smile, his voice smooth as silk. He painted me as a resentful old man, estranged from his son, desperate to place blame. "Mr. Dalton has convinced himself of a story," he said. "But ladies and gentlemen, stories are not facts." He waved toward the jury as if my life were a novel he could tear apart page by page. Robert took the stand first. He walked slowly, leaning on his cane, but his voice carried steady across the room. "I remember the taste," he said. "Bitter. Not like any whiskey I'd ever had. Within an hour, I couldn't stand. I thought my heart was failing. But it wasn't my heart. It was someone else's idea." Caldwell tried to shake him. "Isn't it possible you mixed medication with alcohol, causing your collapse?" Robert's eyes narrowed. "Son, I've been on those meds for 10 years. Never once did they land me in the hospital until that night. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." A ripple went through the jury box. I knew they believed him. Then Reyes testified, presenting the texts from Ethan's burner phone. He read them aloud, each one like a nail sealing Ethan's fate. "Make sure he gets it all in the first pour. Don't change the dosage this time. The jurors leaned forward, faces tightening. Caldwell objected, tried to argue about privacy violations, but the judge overruled him. Finally, it was my turn. I took the stand, swore the oath, and told the story. Plain the birthday package, the hospital call, Gary's test. Ethan's silence when I asked if he tampered with the whiskey. I spoke evenly, not with anger, but with the weight of a man who had carried this too long. Caldwell came at me harder than anyone. Mr. Dalton, isn't it true you sold your late wife's farm without your son's consent, that you've held resentment toward him for years? The DA objected, but Caldwell had already planted his seed. I steadied my voice. Yes, our relationship was strained, but facts don't vanish because feelings get in the way. The whiskey was poisoned. The texts prove intent. This isn't about resentment. It's about survival. By the time I stepped down, my legs felt heavy as stone. I knew the jury had heard enough. But hearing wasn't the same as deciding. The judge dismissed us for the day, and as I left, Ethan called my name across the room. Dad. His voice was calm, almost casual. This isn't over. So let me ask you, if your own blood looked you in the eye after trying to kill you and said this isn't over, would you feel fear or only resolve? The jury deliberated for less than a day, but those hours stretched like years. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Reyes at my side, and Robert dozing in a chair, his cane balanced across his lap. Every tick of the clock reminded me that this wasn't just about evidence, it was about whether strangers would believe a father over a son. When the bailiff finally opened the door and called us back in, the room felt sharper than before, like the air itself was bracing for impact. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. My heart thudded steady but hard, each beat reminding me that one way or another this chapter would close. The foreman stood. He didn't look at Ethan. He didn't look at me. He looked straight at the judge. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The word landed quiet but absolute, like the first drop of rain after a drought. No gasps, no outbursts. Just a silence that shifted the entire weight of the room. Ethan didn't flinch. He sat with his hands cuffed in front of him, his gaze fixed above the judge's head, as if none of it applied to him. If I didn't know better, I'd have thought he was bored. But when they rose to escort him out, he turned his head at the last moment. Our eyes locked. His lips moved just enough for me to read them. This isn't the last chapter. The judge continued, her voice steady. Sentencing 25 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for the first 15. The words rolled out like stone blocks being laid one after the other. Unyielding. Final. I thought relief would flood me, but it didn't. What came instead was a hollow ache. Justice had been served on paper, but nothing on paper could glue back what had shattered between us. Outside, Robert rested a hand on my shoulder. You did what you had to do, he said. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I nodded, but the question still gnawed inside me. Had I lost more than I had won? When I reached my truck, the court clerk handed me an envelope. Inside was Ethan's property inventory, watch belt, wallet, and a folded note. His handwriting, no mistaking it this time. You always said we were more alike than I wanted to admit. Maybe now you'll see that's not a compliment. No signature. Just that bitter line. I slid it into the fireproof box when I got home, setting it beside the stack of index cards and evidence sleeves. The box was full now, a record of betrayal written in poisoned photographs and silence. That night, I sat on the porch swing. I had finally repaired a mug of black coffee in my hands. The yard stretched quiet before me. For the first time in weeks, no porch creaked on its own. No headlights idled at the corner. No unknown number buzzed my phone. So let me ask you, if justice brought you safety, but not peace, would you call it victory or just survival? The weeks after the verdict were quieter than I expected. No more late-night voicemails, no more envelopes slipped under my door, no more photos of myself printed like trophies from the dark. The silence was almost too clean, like a battlefield after the smoke clears and you realize you're the only one still standing. Robert recovered quicker than the doctors predicted. When I visited, he was propped up in his chair by the window color back in his cheeks, cane leaning close. "They tell me I should thank you," he said one afternoon. "But I don't. You gave me a poisoned gift. Then you carried the guilt that belonged to someone else." His voice softened. "You carried it steady, Frank. That's the part I thank you for." I nodded, though the words didn't ease the weight. The truth was, I had put the bottle in his hands. My son may have poured the poison, but I had delivered it. That guilt didn't vanish with a guilty verdict. It simply changed shape. At home, the fireproof box sat heavy on the closet shelf. I opened it one evening and flipped through the contents: Gary's lab report, the mason jar with its faint amber glow, Leah's screenshots of the jars in Ethan's garage, the photo of me writing at my table, the note he'd left after sentencing. Each piece was evidence, yes, but also scars. Proof of what had been lost. One night, Gary stopped by with a paper bag. Inside was the vial he had tested, the one with the whiskey that could have ended me. "Thought you might want to keep it," he said. "Not as a trophy, as a reminder." I set it next to Robert's empty glass, the one he'd sipped from before collapsing. Together, they looked almost innocent, like props in a still-life painting. But I knew better. They weren't symbols of death avoided, they were reminders of trust destroyed. When Reyes visited a month later, he leaned against my porch rail, sunglasses, catching the low winter sun. Frank, the prosecutor's office, closed it airtight. Between the notebook, the texts, the lab results, and your testimony, it was one of the cleanest cases I've worked. But cases don't fix families. I looked out at the bare trees. Families don't always want fixing. He nodded, saying nothing more. Sometimes silence is the truest kind of agreement. That night I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the note Ethan had written me after sentencing. "You always said we were more alike than I wanted to admit. Maybe now you'll see that's not a compliment." I folded it carefully and slid it back into the envelope. For the first time, I didn't feel anger when I read it. Just sorrow. Justice had been served. Ethan was locked away. Robert was healing, but the cost was high, too high for any father to count. So let me ask you, if justice demanded sacrificing the bond with your child forever, would you still pay the price, or would you turn away and live with the risk? Winter settled in heavy that year, the kind of Missouri cold that makes the air taste like iron. Snow dusted the edges of the porch, and my boots left prints that lingered longer than I cared to see. Life should have felt safer now that Ethan was behind bars, but peace doesn't arrive with a gavel strike. It has to be built slow and steady, like a fence line that needs checking every morning. One evening, I pulled the fireproof box from the closet and set it on the table. Inside were the artifacts of betrayal: the mason jar with its faint glow, the vial Gary had tested, the screenshots Leah had saved, the threatening notes and photos, and Ethan's last letter. I laid them out one by one like cards in a bad poker hand. Each piece told the same story of a son who had chosen poison over blood, and a father who had chosen truth over silence. Robert came by a week later, walking slower but with determination in his step. He leaned on his cane at the door, snow melting on his boots. "I wanted to see you face to face," he said. "Doctors say I'm lucky to be here." "You're alive," I answered. "Luck doesn't cover it. You've got grit." He studied me for a moment. And you've got something most men don't, the courage to put justice before blood. That's not easy. But it's right. His words hit hard, not as praise, but as a reminder. Right didn't mean painless. Right just meant necessary. After he left, I sat at the porch swing with a mug of black coffee, staring at the frozen yard. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and fell silent. The house creaked with the settling of old wood, but this time I didn't mistake it for footsteps. For the first time in months, I felt alone in the way a man is supposed to feel, alone in control of his own space. Still, every so often I'd hear Ethan's voice echo in my mind. This isn't the last chapter. The words clung to me like smoke refusing to leave. And maybe he was right. Maybe there would always be another page, another scar, another memory I couldn't bury. That night I wrote a final card for the fireproof box, verdict guilty. Sentence 25 years. Cost family. I slid it on top of the stack and shut the lid. The box was heavy now, not from its contents, but from everything it represented. As I turned off the lights and headed for bed, I paused at the hallway mirror. The man staring back at me looked older than he had a year ago, lines deeper, eyes heavier. But behind the wear, I saw something else resolve. A man still standing even after betrayal tried to tear him down. So let me ask you, if survival cost you your family's love, would you count yourself broken, or would you count yourself free? When I look back on everything, the bottle, the hospital, the trial, I realize justice doesn't arrive clean. It arrives scarred. My son's betrayal cut deeper than any blade could, and no verdict, no sentence can sew that wound shut. 25 years behind bars won't return the trust we lost, or the family dinners that turned into empty chairs. Justice gave me safety, but it did not give me peace. What I've learned is this family isn't just blood. It's the people who stand beside you when the storms come, like Robert fixing my roof before I could ask, or Gary running tests without hesitation, or Linda's steady hand, even from memory. And sometimes the hardest thing a father can do is admit his child has chosen a path that leaves no room for forgiveness. If you're listening to this, and you have children, hear me well, pay attention to the choices they make, but never excuse them when those choices bring harm. Protecting family doesn't mean turning a blind eye. Sometimes it means holding them accountable so they can't destroy anyone else. Now I want to ask you, have you ever faced betrayal from someone you loved more than your own life? How did you handle it, and what lesson did you carry forward? Share it in the comments so we can learn from one another. And if this story spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for listening.